The first bullet arrived before anyone heard the gun. 1 second, Sergeant Harlan Drake was giving hand signals through the tree line. The next, he was on the ground, blood spreading through his tactical vest like ink dropped in water. Then the second shot came. And the third. The forest erupted, not with explosions, but with that particular silence between gunshots that soldiers learned to fear more than the noise itself. 8 professional snipers had turned Blackwood Forest into a killing box, and the squad had walked straight into the center of it. Radio said reinforcements were 45 minutes out. The team had maybe 4 minutes left. Then a woman nobody believed in picked up her rifle and asked for 30 seconds. If a story like this deserves to be heard, hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Every comment tells me you're out there. Don't let this one pass you by. The mission brief had been straightforward. Dangerously, insultingly straightforward. Penetrate the northern perimeter of Blackwood Forest. Establish observation posts at 3 designated coordinates. Record enemy movement patterns along the supply corridor. Extract before 1800 hours. No contact. No engagement. A surveillance run dressed up in tactical language. The kind of assignment veteran operators completed on autopilot while thinking about what they'd eat back at base. That was the lie they'd all agreed to believe. Blackwood Forest sat in the northernmost stretch of Ravinia, a country that existed in the uncomfortable gray zone between active war and frozen conflict, the kind of place where official maps showed ceasefire lines and actual boots on the ground showed something else entirely. The trees here were old and enormous, Scandinavian tall pines that blocked the sky and created a perpetual twilight even at noon. In October, the forest floor was a carpet of brown needles and pale mud that swallowed sound. Mist clung to everything below knee height. The cold had the specific quality of high-altitude cold. It didn't bite so much as it settled inside you, slow and patient. First Squad, 3rd Reconnaissance, had 12 operators. They moved in a staggered column formation through the underbrush, spacing themselves 15 meters apart, communicating through hand signals and the occasional burst of encrypted radio traffic. At the front walked Staff Sergeant Harlan Drake, 34 years old, compact and deliberate, a 15-year operator who moved through forests the way water moves downhill, instinctively, without wasted motion. Behind him, Corporal Tomas Vega handled the SATCOM unit. Then came the medic, Specialist Jules Barrow. Then 8 more soldiers whose names and faces and small private anxieties filled the column like links in a chain nobody had thought to inspect recently. And near the back, quiet as a shadow that hadn't decided where to fall yet, walked Avery Cross. 29 years old, average height, brown hair cut short enough to fit cleanly under a helmet. She carried a MK-11 Mod 0 sniper system, suppressor attached, the rifle slung across her back with the ease of someone who had been carrying that exact weight for so long it had simply become part of her body. 6 months with the unit. In those 6 months, she had fired exactly 0 rounds in a combat context, attended every briefing without speaking, run every physical evaluation without complaint, and established herself thoroughly in the minds of her teammates as a woman who was probably fine, but probably not someone you'd want covering your 6 when things went genuinely wrong. Nobody said it directly. Nobody had to. Combat units develop a social grammar faster than any civilian institution, and within 6 months the grammar around Avery Cross had been written clearly. Quiet, competent maybe, unproven definitely, probably shouldn't be on a real mission. Drake was too professional to say it out loud. Vega wasn't quite professional enough, and twice in the past month had made comments, small, technically deniable, about snipers who couldn't pull when it counted. Barrow, the medic, said nothing either way. Barrow had learned early that the forest always showed you who a person was eventually. No point in writing the story before the forest had a chance to speak. They were 42 minutes into the movement when Drake raised his fist. Everyone froze. The forest had changed, not loudly. Nothing as crude as a snapping branch or startled birds lifting off. Just a shift in quality. The mist felt slightly different. The silence had a different texture to it, the way silence feels when something is listening to you, rather than simply being absent. Drake held the position for 6 full seconds, scanning the canopy with deliberate slowness. Nothing moved. He lowered his fist and signaled continue. Avery didn't continue immediately. She stood one extra second, head tilted slightly, and looked up at the tall pines 40 meters to the east. The branches were motionless, but there was a shadow up there that didn't quite make sense given the angle of the gray afternoon light, something that occupied space at an angle a branch didn't grow. She opened her mouth. The first bullet came before the sound did. It hit Drake in the upper left chest, punched through the plate carrier's side panel where the ceramic didn't cover, and dropped him sideways into the mud. He didn't cry out. The air simply left his lungs in a fast, compressed sound, and then he was on the ground, and the radio handset clattered away from his fingers. Then the world shattered. 3 shots in the next 2 seconds. Not the cracking thunder of close-range fire, but the sharp, compressed snap of high-velocity rounds arriving from distance, from altitude, from multiple directions simultaneously. Vega went down immediately, the SATCOM unit spinning away into the brush. Private Solace threw himself behind a pine trunk and screamed something that wasn't a word. The column collapsed like a string of lights going out one by one, bodies dropping to the mud, others sprinting for cover. The formation that Drake had spent 42 minutes maintaining evaporating in under 4 seconds. Barrow was already moving toward Drake, low and fast, using the topography rather than running upright. She slid the last meter on her knees and pressed both hands against the entry wound, feeling the blood, reading the injury, the way medics learn to read injuries, fast, tactile, without letting the face show what the hands are learning. Drake, stay with me. I need you to talk to me. Chest, Drake said. The word came out compressed, wet. Right side's okay, left side's bad. I know, keep your arms still. She was already opening the trauma kit, pressure dressing, her movements fast and practiced even though her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the specific adrenaline of a medic who has found a treatable wound and is now racing time rather than luck. Avery had hit the ground the same second as everyone else, rolling left behind a fallen oak that gave her maybe 18 inches of real cover and a sightline across 30 meters of kill zone. Her heart was doing what hearts do in the first 6 seconds of an ambush, hammering, flooding the body with everything it had. But her hands were already moving, off the back sling, scope covers off, cheek to stock. She scanned. The forest gave her nothing. That was the point. Professional snipers didn't sit where you'd look for snipers. They sat where the light was wrong, where the shadow fell awkward, where the geometry of the space made a person's eyes slide away naturally. 8 of them, if the pattern of initial fire meant anything, 3 distinct firing positions she could estimate, which meant probably 2 each, staggered coverage. Private Reyes appeared beside her, pressing himself flat against the far end of the log. We need to move. We need to... Stay down. There's 8 of them up there, at least. We can't... Stay down. Avery said it the second time without raising her voice. Something in the flatness of it made Reyes stop talking. Give me 30 seconds. 30 seconds? She didn't answer him. She was already scanning again. The radio, what was left of working radio, crackled in someone's earpiece. Corporal Mendez had gotten to the secondary handset and was transmitting voice-controlled, doing the job Drake couldn't do right now. Actual, this is 3-1 actual alternate. We are in contact grid. She called out the grid reference, coordinates from memory because the SATCOM was somewhere in the mud. Requesting immediate reinforcement, QRF extraction. We have 2 critical casualties. The response came back in the clipped tone of someone at a command post looking at a map that made the math painfully clear. 3-1. QRF is 47 minutes out minimum. Authenticate Hotel Foxtrot. Hotel Foxtrot confirmed. 47 minutes. Mendez looked at Barrow. Barrow didn't look up from Drake. She just shook her head very slightly, meaning he doesn't have 47 minutes if the bleeding doesn't stop, and if they take another casualty in the next 60 seconds, we are going to lose more than 1 person today. 47 minutes. In a kill zone this well established, 47 minutes was a geological time frame. It was an ocean to cross with a paper boat. Another shot came in, this one passing through the space where Solace had been crouching half a second before, and Solace made a sound that was not quite a scream and scrambled deeper behind his pine. The round struck the bark and sent a spray of white wood into the cold air, 6 inches to the right, and they'd need a second pressure dressing. Avery watched where the round had come from. The trajectory, the angle of impact on the bark, the sound delay between impact and the distant crack of the rifle. 320 meters. Elevated position, east-northeast. Probably a natural fork in one of the big pines, modified. They were here before us. This was pre-sighted. They ranged this whole sector, she said, mostly to herself. Then louder. Reyes. What? Get everyone on the west side of their cover, not behind, west side. They've pre-ranged the east approaches. How do you know? The first shot hit Drake in the left chest at an angle. His body was angled north. They're elevated east, 30-some degrees. They ranged from the east. Move west. A 2-second silence. Move west, Reyes yelled it down the line. They moved. 2 soldiers shifted position a half-second before another round came in and hit exactly where one of them had been kneeling. Someone whispered something like, "Oh my God." Avery was already not there anymore. She had rolled left, moved 10 meters through the undergrowth using the dead ground she'd identified. A slight depression in the terrain that put 18 inches of actual earth between her and the primary firing positions. Moving slowly. Not panicking. Ignoring the specific terror that came with moving during active sniper contact, when every step felt like choosing the moment of your own death. Barrow pressed a hand against Drake's chest, feeling the rise and fall, counting the rate. Too fast. Too shallow. He'd lost blood pressure. He was still conscious, but the quality of his consciousness was changing, getting distant and slow the way it did when the body was deciding what was essential and what wasn't. Avery. Drake's voice was barely there. Where is she going? Don't talk. Barrow, where is she going? To fix this, Barrow said. And she meant it exactly that plainly. No decoration, because she had seen Avery's eyes in the moment before she moved, and there had been something in them that Barrow had no professional language for yet. Just certainty. The specific certainty of someone who has done something so many times that fear hasn't really found a way in anymore. Avery settled behind the fallen oak's root ball, 60 meters left of her original position. She was now at a different angle to the eastern ridge. The pines were dense, but not impenetrable. Between the trunks, through the needles, there were windows. Tiny, inconsistent, moving slightly with the faint wind. She slowed her breathing. The technique wasn't something she'd been taught in a classroom. It had been burned into her across 2 years of operations she was not permitted to discuss, in environments considerably less forgiving than Blackwood Forest, against targets considerably more skilled than the operators currently occupying these trees. Her heart rate dropped. Not by willpower, by conditioning, by 10,000 repetitions of exactly this moment. The world narrowed. The cold mist became irrelevant. The sound of SOLACE breathing too fast 40 meters behind her became irrelevant. The 47 minutes became irrelevant. There was only the space between the trees, the angles, the shadows that didn't quite fit. She found the first one by his breath. Not literally. She couldn't hear him at this distance. But breath made vapor in cold air, and vapor, even a thin wisp of it, caught the light differently than pine branches did. A small pale smear, 20 degrees elevation, approximately 300 meters east-northeast in the fork of a pine where the branch geometry had been modified. One natural branch removed. A slight platform built from what looked like dead wood hauled up from the forest floor. It was good. The hide was genuinely impressive. He'd been up there for hours, maybe longer, waiting in the cold with the patience of someone who was very serious about this job. Avery cross-referenced the shadow angle, the vapor trace, the probable distance, the wind from the northwest at maybe 4 knots based on the needle movement 30 meters out. She exhaled. She squeezed. The Mk-11 fired with a sound like a hand clap through a heavy door. Suppressed, but not silent. The round traveled 310 meters in a third of a second. The body came down through the branches the way a puppet falls when someone cuts the strings. Not dramatically, just the organization that had been holding it in place stopped, and gravity remembered it was there. Silence. Then Reyes said very quietly, "What the—" The forest didn't answer. Neither did Avery. She was already moving again, 6 meters right, staying in the depression, changing her angle by 11 degrees. The second firing position had given itself away in the moment after the first shot. A micro-movement. Someone up in the trees flinching at the sound of their partner falling, turning their head fractionally toward the noise. There. Her second shot found him while he was still processing what had happened to the first one. 2 down. The forest went briefly, completely still. And then the remaining 6 positions opened up at once. not at the squad, but into the trees around where Avery's shots had come from. Suppressive fire. Disorganized. Breaking from the discipline they'd maintained for the past 4 minutes. Which meant they were scared. Which meant they didn't know where she was. Which meant they'd already lost. She pressed herself flat into the mud as rounds tore through the pine needles 6 feet above her head. Cold earth against her face. The smell of wet soil and old needles and something faintly metallic that was either her own fear or the cold. She waited 3 seconds. Counted the firing positions by muzzle signature and delay. Found the third one by the angle of his tracer. Moved another 8 meters through the depression. Back at the squad's position, something had changed. The medic's hands had steadied. The soldiers who'd been frozen were beginning to understand, in the primitive wordless way that humans understand when odds shift, that something different was happening in this forest. Reyes crawled to where Mendez was holding the radio. "Tell QRF to hold the clock. Just tell them to hold the clock." Mendez stared at him. "You want me to tell command to hold the QRF? I'm telling you something is happening out there, and we should not bring a fast reaction force into this forest until we understand what it is." Another shot from somewhere to the west of them. One crisp, controlled report from a MK-11. And somewhere up in the pines, something heavy fell. 3. Mendez looked at the trees, looked at Reyes. Slowly, she keyed the radio. "Actual, this is 3-1 alternate. Request QRF hold position at Grid Whiskey 7. We have a developing situation. Advise 30-minute delay pending assessment." A pause from command. Then, 3-1. Confirm. You are requesting QRF hold? Confirmed. Requesting hold. Drake drifting now, blood pressure dropping, chest wound sealed as well as Barrow could manage in a pine forest in October, opened one eye and looked at the trees. "Is she—" "Don't talk. Barrow. Drake." He closed his eye again, but his mouth moved very quietly, forming a sentence that Barrow heard but didn't repeat to anyone for a long time afterward. "I should have listened to her earlier." A fourth shot broke the silence like a line drawn through it. Then the forest went very, very quiet, and it stayed quiet in a way that felt fundamentally different from before. Not the quiet of predators waiting, but the quiet of something that had gone wrong for the hunters and not yet been fully understood by anyone left alive to understand it. Somewhere above, in the cold gray canopy of Blackwood Forest, leaves drifted down without wind. The leaves settled into the mud without a sound. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The squad held their positions behind tree trunks and fallen logs and the shallow depression that ran along the western side of the kill zone, and they listened to the forest the way soldiers listen when they're trying to determine whether the silence means over or means waiting. These were 2 very different kinds of silence, and every operator with enough field time learned to feel the difference in the back of their teeth. This silence felt like the first kind, but nobody was certain enough to stand up and test that theory. Reyes had his rifle up, scanning the canopy east-northeast, picking apart the shadows between branches. The way you pick apart a dream the morning after, trying to find the architecture that made sense of what you'd experienced. He'd seen the bodies fall. He'd counted the shots. 4 of them now, each one arriving from a slightly different angle, each one finding a target in a tree line that had seemed, 60 seconds ago, completely impenetrable. He was trying to square that with the woman he'd watched move through the forest, the one who'd said 30 seconds and then simply vanished into the undergrowth like she'd been trained by the trees themselves. He couldn't square it, so he kept his mouth shut and his rifle up. Barrow had both hands inside Drake's vest now, managing the chest seal, checking the secondary improvised pressure wrap she'd built from the trauma kit and her own tourniquet. The pneumothorax risk was real. The round had entered the lateral chest wall at an angle that made her nervous about lung involvement, and the wet sounds Drake made when he inhaled told her things she didn't want to say out loud. His blood pressure was low. His color was gray in the October light. He was conscious, which was both good news and also the kind of good news that had an expiration date on it. "Stay awake," she told him. "I'm awake." "Your eyes are closed." "I can be awake with my eyes closed." A pause. A wet breath. "Where is she?" "I don't know." "How many?" "4. That I counted." Drake opened one eye. His expression said something that his mouth didn't bother forming into words. Mendez was still on the radio, maintaining the communication picture. keeping command updated in the clipped professional shorthand of someone trying to give accurate information without revealing how badly she wanted to scream. QRF was holding at the rally point 7 clicks south. Command wanted status updates every 5 minutes. Command also wanted to know why a 12-person reconnaissance squad that had made contact with an unknown-size enemy sniper element was requesting a delay in reinforcement, and Mendez didn't have a clean answer to that question. The cleanest answer was, because whatever is happening in this forest right now is working, and introducing 40 additional variables into it might break whatever it is. That wasn't the kind of reasoning that translated well into encrypted radio traffic. She kept it simple. Developing situation, casualty status unchanged, requesting continued hold. SOLACE was the first one to say what everyone was thinking, which was typical of SOLACE, who had never quite mastered the military discipline of keeping your observations to yourself until you were certain they weren't stupid. "She's still out there," he said, to nobody in particular. I was crouched behind a pine trunk, rifle at low ready, mud caking the side of his face where he'd hit the ground hard after the second volley. I counted 4 shots. There were at least 6 more positions when they opened up. "At least 6, said Kowalski, the next closest operator. "Could be 8, 10. "Could be 10, SOLACE agreed. "And she's still out there, alone." The sentence sat in the cold air. Kowalski didn't respond. She was running the same math SOLACE was running, arriving at the same uncomfortable destination. 6 to 10 professional snipers who had established pre-sighted positions in a forest they obviously knew well, who had executed a textbook L-shaped ambush against a 12-person recon element, who had put down the squad leader and the SATCOM operator in the first 4 seconds. These were not militia fighters with hunting rifles. The precision of the opening volley, the pre-sighting, the coordinated fields of fire. These were people with real training, real equipment, real patience. People who had been planning this specific ambush in this specific forest for longer than First Squad had known this mission existed. And Avery Cross, the woman Vega had called the maybe, said it quietly enough that she probably wasn't supposed to hear, probably had heard, was somewhere in that forest alone with 6 to 10 of them. "She needs support," SOLACE said. "She told us to stay down," Reyes said. "She said stay down. She didn't say let her die alone out there. If we move, we give away positions we haven't given away yet. If we're stupid about it, we get shot and then she has nothing to come back to." Reyes kept his voice flat, which cost him something. "We stay down. We hold. We trust whatever she's doing." SOLACE looked at him for a long second. "You trust it." I counted 4 shots, 4 kills, no return fire that found her, in a pre-established kill zone against professional snipers. Reyes lowered his rifle slightly. "Yeah, I trust it." SOLACE opened his mouth, then closed it, then pressed himself back against the pine and looked up into the canopy and said nothing, which for SOLACE was a fairly dramatic statement. The 5th shot came 9 minutes after the 4th. It came from further north than the others. Avery had moved laterally through the depression again, working through the dead ground in an arc that was taking her progressively around the eastern flank of the ambush line. The shot came at a shallow angle through a gap between 2 pines that from ground level looked like no gap at all, and the sound that followed it, the particular sound of a large caliber round finding a human body at distance, was brief and final and awful in the way that sound always was, no matter how many times you heard it. Then silence again. Then a 6th shot, 40 seconds after the 5th, from a position that was clearly not the same position. She'd moved again. After every trigger pull, she was moving, not randomly, purposefully, following some internal map that accounted for the topography, the fields of fire, the way the remaining enemy positions would be adjusting their awareness after losing a partner. Reyes pressed his hand against the fallen log and breathed. Kowalski said, very quietly, "She's hunting them." Nobody argued with that. The remaining snipers had lost cohesion. This was the part that the training manuals didn't adequately prepare you for, the psychological dimension of being hunted by someone you couldn't locate. The manual told you that a counter-sniper threat required repositioning, range estimation, and coordinated suppressive fire to the estimated origin point. The manual assumed you could estimate the origin point. The manual assumed your partners were still available for coordination. The manual had been written in classrooms by people who hadn't spent 40 seconds listening to 3 partners disappear from a forest without ever seeing the shooter. Ghost 7 had been the call sign assigned to the sniper team lead, a man whose real name was not relevant to anyone in Blackwood Forest that afternoon, because names were operational security liabilities, and he hadn't used his in weeks. He'd been at this for 7 years across 4 countries under 3 different employer arrangements. He was good at the work in the way that some people are good at things that require patience and distance and a capacity to feel nothing when the trigger moved. The ambush had been perfectly planned. The fields of fire were clean. The squad had walked into the kill zone exactly as predicted. He had not predicted this. He was repositioning now, moving through his alternate hide on the east ridge, a secondary position he'd built for exactly this kind of contingency. Heavy branches above, good concealment, commanding view of the western approach. He pressed himself into the fork of the pine and swept his scope through the forest floor below. Nothing. Whoever was doing this wasn't using the forest floor. They were using the dead ground, the depressions and folds in the terrain that his team had identified as movement corridors and had calculated to be covered by positions 3 and 5. Positions 3 and 5 were no longer operational. He keyed his radio. 2 clicks. Waiting for a response from the remaining element. 1 click from Bauer, his last confirmed active partner to the south. Nothing from the others. He forced himself to process that with professional neutrality. 4 gone. Bauer south. Unknown shooter working through the eastern arc. Unknown skill level, though the outcomes suggested. He didn't finish that particular thought. Finishing it wasn't useful right now. Operational thinking. What did he know? What could he do? He knew the unknown shooter was suppressed MK11, Mod 0, or similar, American military pattern. He knew she was working the dead ground corridor. He knew she'd been changing positions after every shot, which meant she was trained in counter-sniper protocols beyond the standard military curriculum. He knew she was alone, because a coordinated 2-person team would have produced different shot geometry. A lone shooter with counter-sniper training, working through a kill zone his team had built. That was unusual. He swept his scope south along the dead ground corridor, calculating where a shooter moving in that arc would be at this point in time, accounting for conservative movement speed. The branch behind his left shoulder exploded. Not a hit. Close. Extremely close. He dropped instinctively, flattening into the fork, bark fragments cutting his cheek, the sound of the shot arriving a third of a second after the round, which meant the shooter was inside 300 meters and had fired from a position that covered his alternate hide as well as his primary, which meant she knows the ridge. She knows the hide positions. He went ice cold. She wasn't tracking him by movement. She was working from the topology itself, identifying where professional snipers would sight positions in this specific terrain and hunting those locations in sequence, which meant his secondary, his tertiary, every position he'd established in this forest was potentially already plotted on a map in her head. He rolled out of the fork and dropped 12 feet to a branch below, then scrambled laterally across the tree's main trunk, moving fast, abandoning concealment discipline because right now concealment was less important than not being in a location she had already anticipated. He hit the second branch hard, the impact sending a rattling shudder through the pine, and froze. 60 meters to his south, in the forest floor's mist, he saw nothing. No one. No movement. He was breathing too fast. He recognized it. He tried to slow it. Somewhere to his east, deeper in the forest than it should have been possible for anyone to have moved in this time frame, a pine branch swayed once against the wind. Avery was flat on her stomach in 3 inches of mud, 60 meters south of the ridge tree she'd just fired at, and she was deeply aware that the shot had missed. Not by much. Not by much at all. But close wasn't the same as done, and the target, she'd tagged him in her mind as the coordinator, because his positioning and the pattern of his radio clicks suggested command function, had moved faster than she'd expected, which meant he was better than she'd expected, which meant she needed to revise her estimate of what the remaining threat looked like. She moved the MK11 slightly, adjusting for the new position she'd seen him scrambling to after the near miss. The problem was he was moving through the upper canopy now, rather than maintaining a stationary hide, which changed the math significantly. A moving target at 300 meters in a dense pine forest through a 4-inch window of sightline was a fundamentally different calculation than a stationary target in a pre-mapped position. She could wait. Let him settle into a new hide, estimate the position, work the angles. or she could move again. She moved. Crawling through the mud on her elbows, Mikhailevin cradled across her forearms, moving in absolute silence that required slowing down to a pace that felt criminally slow, with an unknown number of professional snipers still operational in this forest. The instinct in these moments was always to move faster. Speed felt like safety. But speed made noise, and noise was a location, and a location was a target. She'd learned that in places she wasn't allowed to name, from instructors whose methods she couldn't describe, in conditions that made Blackwood Forest feel like a training range. She thought about Drake, his color, the wet sound of his breathing. She moved a little faster. The depression she was working through bent northeast as she followed it, and she climbed slightly, pulling herself up through a root system with her elbows and knees, getting eyes on the eastern ridge at a new angle that gave her a view of 3 pine crowns she hadn't been able to see before. She held there. Still. Let the forest forget she existed. 2 minutes. Then Bauer, the southern position, the last confirmed active after the coordinator, made the mistake that overconfident people make when they believe their partner still has eyes on the threat. He shifted his weight. It was a tiny shift, a redistribution of balance after staying in one position too long, and it moved a branch that was in contact with his left shoulder, and the branch moved in a way that didn't match the wind. Avery put him down with a clean shot to the center mass. 7. She lay in the mud afterward, breathing carefully, listening, counting. Running through the geometry of the original ambush, the position she'd mapped from the opening volley, the position she'd cleared. 7 confirmed. 1 near miss on the coordinator who'd gone mobile. That left at minimum the coordinator active, possibly 1 more she'd underestimated or miscounted in the chaos of the opening engagement. She keyed her radio, 1 click, listening. The forest answered with its own silence. She moved northeast toward the coordinator's last position, some. Back at the squad's position, the math was changing. Barrow had stabilized Drake to the degree that field medicine allowed, which was the degree of alive but needs a surgical team inside the next 2 hours. The chest seal was holding. His breathing, while still shallow, was no longer making the sounds that made Barrow's jaw tighten. He was conscious in a fragile way, the kind of consciousness that required very little disturbance to tip into something darker, but it was consciousness. Mendez was updating command every 5 minutes with information that command found increasingly difficult to categorize. 7 confirmed enemy KIA. Unknown method. Casualty from friendly element unchanged. No additional friendly casualties since initial contact. The response from command had evolved from crisp professionalism to a kind of cautious confusion. 3-1. Confirm. 7 enemy KIA. 0 additional friendly KIA. Since initial contact, QR still on hold. Confirmed. Request continued hold pending all clear. Reyes had moved to a new position near the forward edge of their defensive perimeter, using a pine that gave him a fractional view of the eastern ridge. He'd seen the 7th body come down, watched it the same way the others were watching, with an expression that had migrated well past surprise and was now somewhere in the territory of something closer to awe, though none of them would have used that word because the culture they came from didn't have good vocabulary for that particular feeling. Kowalski appeared at his shoulder. 7, she said. 7. Professional network, pre-established positions. The ambush planning alone was... She stopped. That was months of work. Those positions, the pre-sighting, the coordinated fields. I know. Where did she learn that? She's been with us 6 months and she's never... I know. The word came out harder than Reyes intended. Kowalski looked at him. He looked back at the ridge. I don't know, he said, quieter. That's the honest answer. I don't know where she learned that. I don't know what she did before she showed up with our unit. I don't know what's in her file because I was never given her file because that's not how it works. And I was... He stopped himself. I made an assumption, based on nothing. We all did. Kowalski didn't respond to that. There wasn't much to say. The assumption had been collective and comfortable and completely unfounded, and the man currently bleeding into the mud with a sealed chest wound was in part a casualty of it. Not because Avery could have prevented the ambush, but because if they'd understood what she was capable of, they might have positioned her differently, used her differently, and the first seconds of the contact might have gone in a direction that didn't begin with their squad leader on the ground. Might have. The hypothetical was brutal and useless, and Reyes felt it anyway. Solus crawled up from their left flank. I heard 8 shots total, he said. 8. She's been out there. He checked his watch. 22 minutes. The number sat in the air. 22 minutes. One person, alone, in active enemy contact, against a professional multi-person sniper network with pre-established positions and coordinated coverage. No backup, no spotter, moving through mud and mist in October light that was failing earlier than it should because the clouds had rolled in from the north and the gray was getting darker. Someone should go out there, Solus said. She told us to stay down, Reyes said, for the second time, but his voice didn't have quite the same certainty it had before. He was watching the ridge, watching the places where the trees met the sky and trying to find the geometry of what was still up there. She told us to stay down at the start. That was 22 minutes ago. The situation is different, I know, but going out there without knowing where she is, where they are, the geometry of whoever is still active. We could walk into a position she's about to clear and put ourselves between her and a target, or we could trigger the last one and give away her approach. Reyes shook his head. We're more useful here. She's one person. She's been one person for 22 minutes, and the score is 7-0. Reyes looked at Solus. I'm not going to be the one who walks into her lane. Solus pressed his forehead against the bark of the pine and breathed through his nose and didn't say anything else. Barrow spoke without looking up from Drake. She knows we're here. She knows where we are. If she needs us, she'll call. A pause. Let her work. Nobody moved. Drake's hand found Barrow's wrist. Weak grip. Barely there. She's going to make it, he said. Barrow looked down at him. Which she are we talking about? Drake's mouth made something that was probably supposed to be a smile and didn't quite get there. His eyes closed again. Both, he said. Us. The coordinator had found a new position, not a pre-built hide because his pre-built hides were now a liability rather than an asset, but a natural one. The collapse of a pine decades ago had created a root mass at the eastern edge of the ridge, and he was pressed into the gap behind it, rifle forward, scanning the forest below. He'd been here 4 minutes. He hadn't moved since arriving. He was controlling his breathing with the discipline of someone who'd been doing this a long time. He'd counted 8 shots since the engagement began. 8 shots from the same suppressed Mk-11. He had 1 confirmed partner remaining, Bauer to the south. And then he'd heard the 8th shot, and the radio had gone quiet, and now his math was very simple. 1 unknown shooter. 1 of him. The rest of his team was gone. He didn't let himself calculate the probability. Not useful. What he knew, the shooter was working through counter-sniper doctrine, clearing hide positions by working the topology rather than tracking by movement, which meant she'd eventually work to this ridge, which meant he was not safe here regardless of how well he'd concealed himself, because if she was working the topology, she was working toward him whether she could see him or not. He needed to move, or he needed to end this. He calculated angles. She'd been working in a north-northeast arc from the original position. The next logical point in that arc, the next natural vantage on this ridge, was approximately 40 meters to his left. If she was following the topology rather than tracking him specifically, she'd approach from that direction. He could set up a counter-ambush. Let her come to the angle. He thought about the 8 shots, the precision, the movement between positions. He thought about the fact that she'd nearly missed him with the 9th shot. Had missed, but barely, which meant she'd been faster to his alternate position than his own movement time, which meant she'd anticipated it. He looked at the 40 meters of ridge to his left. Maybe she was already there. The thought arrived and he dismissed it, because the alternative was to panic, and panic would kill him faster than an opposing sniper. He pressed himself lower into the root mass and kept scanning. The 9th shot arrived from 11 degrees right of where he'd been watching. The round clipped the top of the root mass and sent a spray of ancient wood across his face, and he was moving before his brain had finished processing the sound, rolling right, dropping below the ridgeline, sliding on the pine needles and mud of the steep eastern face in a way that was barely controlled and not at all elegant. His boot caught a root and his right knee hit a rock and the pain was immediate and white, and he kept moving because stopping was dying. He scrambled to a low crawl and moved south along the base of the ridge, away from the hit position, back toward the center of the forest. Behind him, nothing pursued. That was the part that didn't make sense. She'd had a clear follow-up opportunity. He'd made enough noise sliding down the ridge face that she should have been able to track him by sound alone. She hadn't fired again, which meant either she'd lost him in the transition or she was moving to cut off his escape route. He went still. The forest around him was deep and quiet and dark, with the early darkness of an overcast October afternoon in a pine wood. The mist had thickened in the past 20 minutes. Visibility was down to maybe 40 meters in the densest sections. He was moving in nearly full concealment, which should have been an advantage. He didn't feel like he had an advantage. He felt like an animal that had chased something into a field and was only now starting to understand the terrain had changed. He keyed his radio. One click. Waiting. Nothing. He was alone. He moved south another 10 meters and stopped behind a pine trunk and pressed himself flat and tried to hear beyond his own heartbeat. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Then, from somewhere to his east, not above, not from a hide, but from the ground, from his level, from a position he had not been watching because it wasn't a sniper position, it was just forest. He heard the faint, careful compression of a boot into pine needles, barely a sound at all. She was at ground level. She'd come down from the counter-sniper arc, and she was hunting him on the forest floor. He raised his rifle. Avery had been on the forest floor for 7 minutes. After the near miss on the root mass, she'd hit the bark a centimeter above where she'd wanted, a correctable error that told her she'd miscalculated his depth into the cover by a fraction, which was irritating but not catastrophic. She'd watched him slide down the eastern face and made the decision not to follow immediately. Pursuit shots against a moving target descending a steep face in low visibility were low percentage and loud. And loud was a problem when she didn't know if there were still active positions she'd miscounted in the opening chaos. She'd taken 3 minutes to hold still and listen and count what she knew. 7 confirmed. 1 mobile, the coordinator, Eastern Ridge. Suppressed fire pattern in the opening volley suggested 8 total positions to her, which meant 1 more accounted for. Either confirmed and she'd miscounted, or the 8th was still active somewhere she hadn't cleared. She moved south along the ridge base at ground level, moving slow, moving quiet, rifle at low ready, rather than in the long-range configuration, because at the distances she might encounter the coordinator now, it was a different kind of engagement than what the morning had asked for. She found his trail in the mud. Boot prints, deep and irregular, someone moving fast downhill without caring about sign. Moving south. She followed the trail at offset, not tracking directly on top of it, reading the distance between prints, the depth, the angle of the toe. He'd slowed down. The prints were closer together now, more careful. He'd gotten his fear managed and was moving with discipline again. Good, she thought, in a way that surprised her. A disciplined opponent was predictable. A panicking opponent ran, and running opponents could go anywhere. She stopped beside a pine with a wide base and studied the forest ahead of her for 20 full seconds. The coordinator was behind a trunk approximately 30 meters south. She couldn't see him at all, but the geometry of his trail, the positions he'd moved through, the natural cover features in this section of forest, said he was there. The way the mist moved around one specific area was slightly wrong. Not wrong in any dramatic way. Wrong in the way that only registered after 20 seconds of very focused attention. She didn't raise the rifle. At 30 meters in a dense forest with a mobile, trained target in defensive posture, the rifle was the wrong tool. The rifle was for windows and distance. At 30 meters, she needed to control the angle. She moved left, wide, and slow, using 3 separate pines as intermediate cover, taking almost 2 minutes to move 20 meters. The muddy forest floor swallowed the sound of her boots if she moved carefully enough. At her new angle, she had a partial view of the pine he was behind, a partial view of his shoulder, left side, pressed flat against the bark. She needed 6 more meters left. She started moving. Her boot found a patch of loose needles over a root, and the sound, small, almost nothing, traveled in the quiet forest the way sounds travel when everything else is perfectly still. The coordinator's rifle swept toward her. She dropped straight down. The round passed through the air where she'd been standing at approximately chest height and continued into the pine behind her. She rolled hard right, got her rifle up, and fired from the ground. Not a clean shot, not a controlled position, a rough field expedient shot fired from her side with the rifle at a 45-degree angle. The kind of shot that training ranges didn't practice because training ranges were about perfect conditions. and this was not a perfect condition. The round hit. Not a kill shot. The angle was wrong, and her position was wrong, and what it hit was his right arm. She knew this from the way the rifle dropped from that side. The way his body reaction indicated a struck limb rather than a struck chest. He went behind the pine. She heard him hit the ground. She was already moving up to her knees, then up to a running crouch, closing the 30 meters in a direct approach while he was managing the hit, closing it fast because speed was the only advantage she had right now. Because a man who had just taken a round through the arm and had one functioning rifle hand was dangerous for exactly as long as it took him to use that hand, and she wasn't going to give him the time. She came around the pine at full speed. He was on his knees, left hand on the rifle, right arm hanging and wrong, and he was bringing the rifle up with a speed that said the injury wasn't going to stop him, because this was the kind of man who did not stop. They looked at each other for 1/2 second. Then Avery drove her knee into his wrist, the rifle came free, and she had him face down in the pine needles with his left arm controlled behind his back before the rifle finished falling. He didn't fight it. Not because he'd given up. She could feel the tension in his entire body, the coiled readiness of someone still calculating. But the calculation had completed, and the outcome was the same regardless of the input, and professional people recognized that. He turned his face to the side, his cheek against the cold mud, his breathing fast but controlled. He said, fast but controlled. He said, in accented but clear English, "How did you know where I was?" Avery said nothing. "How did you know the hide positions?" A pause. "Nobody should know those positions. We built them. We surveyed this." He stopped, his breathing steadied. "Who trained you?" She pulled a flex cuff from her vest with her free hand and secured his wrist. "You are not regular military," he said. Not a question. She didn't answer that either. She keyed her radio. 2 clicks, then 3. The code they'd established at mission brief for all clear, coming in. A code she'd never expected to use in this context when the mission brief had been delivered in a warm room with coffee on the table, and this had still been a surveillance operation. Drake's radio crackled. The sound of it, the 2-3 pattern, their code, intact and certain, made Barrow close her eyes briefly, made Reyes exhale against the side of his pine hard enough that the bark shook, made SOLACE put his hands over his face in a way he'd later insist was just fatigue. The coordinator lay in the mud with one wrist secured and one arm destroyed, and said one more thing quietly, with the tone of someone filing an observation rather than making a complaint. "We had 12 people for 12 of yours," he said. "We had this forest for 3 months. We had range cards for every approach, every position, every corridor. We had everything." He paused. "How?" he said. The forest said nothing. Avery Cross said nothing. She stood up, slung her rifle back across her back, and started walking south through the pines toward the sound of a radio and a medic and a squad commander who was alive because she'd bought him the one thing the 47 minutes couldn't buy: time. The coordinator watched her walk away. His face was against the mud. His arm was bleeding through the sleeve. The October cold was working into his bones. He watched her until the trees took her. "Who trained you?" he said to the empty forest. The pines didn't answer. She came out of the trees the way she'd gone in, quiet, unhurried, her boots leaving wet prints in the mud, at the edge of the squad's defensive perimeter. The MK-11 was slung across her back. Her jacket was caked from the elbows down with the dark clay mud of the forest floor, and there was a cut along her jaw she probably didn't know was there, shallow but bleeding in the cold air, tracing a thin red line from her left cheekbone to the corner of her chin. Reyes saw her first. He stood up from behind his pine without thinking about it. A reflex, the kind of thing the body does before the brain gets involved. And for a second, he just looked at her. She was walking normally. No limp, rifle secure. Moving toward them through the mist with the same unhurried economy she'd moved with when she'd left 29 minutes ago. He said her name. Just her name. Nothing attached to it. She looked at him, nodded once. That was the entirety of the reunion. Barrow didn't look up from Drake until Avery's boots appeared at the edge of her field of vision. Then she looked up and took in the cut on the jaw and the mud and the set of Avery's face, which was controlled and exhausted and not showing whatever it was actually feeling. But Barrow was a medic, and medics learned to read the body rather than the expression. "You're hit," Barrow said. "It's surface. Drake first." "Drake is stable. Sit down." I have a prisoner at the base of the eastern ridge. Arm injury. Needs to be secured before... Sit down. Avery sat down. She sat against the fallen log she'd been behind at the very beginning of this, when it had all started, and she put the MK-11 across her knees and let Barrow clean the cut without looking at it. Her eyes stayed on the forest. The tree line. The places between the pines where the mist was thickening, now that the temperature was dropping with the afternoon. Reyes crouched in front of her. 8, he said. 7 confirmed kills. The coordinator is at the ridge base, flex-cuffed, right-arm GSW. Non-life-threatening, but he needs attention before we move. 7? Reyes stopped, started again. There were 8 positions in the opening volley. 7 confirmed. The 8th position I couldn't locate definitively. Either I miscounted from the opening volley, or the 8th element repositioned before I could confirm. She glanced at him for the first time. Her eyes were the specific gray of the sky above them. The coordinator's intel might clarify that. He talked. What did he say? Nothing operationally useful yet, but he'll say more. A pause. He's not going anywhere. Mendez appeared at Reyes's shoulder. She had the radio handset pressed against her ear, her expression doing the thing expressions do when the person is trying to keep their voice neutral for a transmission and is having real difficulty. QRF wants to move, she said. Command is asking for all clear authorization. They've been holding 45 minutes and they want... Tell them all clear, Avery said. Have them bring a surgical team. Drake's chest wound needs evaluation I can't provide in the field, and the prisoner needs his arm looked at. Mendez stared at her. Reyes stared at her. Avery looked at both of them with an expression that was not impatience exactly, but was adjacent to it. The expression of someone who has finished the hard part of a problem and is now waiting for the administrative components to catch up. I'm not in command, Avery said. Mendez, you've been maintaining the picture. Your call. Mendez held the stare for another second. Then she keyed the radio. Actual, this is 3-1 alternate. All clear confirmed, grid whiskey 7. Request QRF advance with organic medical capability. 1 friendly critical plus 1 enemy combatant requiring surgical. Authenticate Hotel Foxtrot. The response came back crisp and fast, the voice at command finally sounding like someone who'd been given permission to exhale. Hotel Foxtrot confirmed. QRF advancing. ETA 14 minutes. What is enemy contact status? Mendez looked at Avery. 7 enemy KIA, Avery said. 1 detained, non-ambulatory. Area is clear. 3-1, please confirm. 7 enemy KIA? Confirmed, Mendez said. 7 enemy KIA. Area is clear. A long pause from command. Long enough that the static on the line became its own kind of commentary. Copy 3-1, QRF is moving. Well done. Mendez lowered the handset. SOLACE said from somewhere to the left, did he just say well done like someone passed a written test? Nobody answered that. Wong. The QRF arrived in 13 minutes rather than 14, which meant they'd started moving before the formal all clear, which meant someone at command level had been watching the situation develop and had made a judgment call about the margin of acceptable risk. The 4 vehicles came in from the southern approach, headlights cutting through the mist that had now fully committed to the late afternoon, and with them came the kind of organized, purposeful noise that told a forest that institutions had arrived and the individual emergency was over. The surgical team went directly to Drake. 2 medics and a flight surgeon kneeling beside him in the mud without ceremony, speaking to Barrow in the compressed professional shorthand of people who needed information in the correct sequence and needed it now. Barrow delivered it the same way. Vitals, estimated blood loss, entry wound location, seal status, time since injury. The flight surgeon's hands were in Drake's vest before Barrow finished her last sentence. Drake, who had drifted in and out for the past 30 minutes, came back to some degree of coherence when he felt the new hands. Cross, he said. Not loudly. To whoever was closest, Reyes was closest. She's here. She okay? Cut on her face. Nothing serious? Drake absorbed this. The flight surgeon was telling him things in a calm, authoritative tone, explaining what they were doing and why, and Drake was letting the words wash over him with the loose, unfocused reception of someone managing significant blood loss. I heard the shots, Drake said. I counted. 7, Reyes said. I counted 8 in the opening volley. She said 7 confirmed. The 8th is unclear. Drake's hand moved toward Reyes's arm and found it. His grip was weak but intentional. "Find the eighth," he said. "The QRF is doing a full sweep. Find it." He said it with the specific weight of someone who had been a squad leader for long enough to know the difference between a mission that was over and a mission that felt over, and who understood clearly that these were not always the same thing. "Don't let the sweep miss anything because everyone's celebrating." Reyes looked at the flight surgeon, who looked up briefly and said, "He's right. Go. We have him." Reyes went. "What?" The coordinator's name was eventually processed as Elias Vren, a name that didn't match any current intelligence file, which was itself a data point, and he was sitting against the base of a pine at the ridge's eastern edge, with one wrist secured to a root and his right arm wrapped in the basic field dressing Avery had applied before she left him. The arm had stopped bleeding properly, which meant the field dressing was doing its job, which meant he was going to be fine in the narrow physical sense of fine that didn't account for everything else. 2 QRF operators were with him when Avery arrived at the ridge. Standing over him, rifles slung, body language communicating the professional discomfort of people who had driven 14 minutes through a forest, expecting to find a massacre, and had instead found one detained prisoner and evidence of a systematic engagement they were still trying to parse. One of the operators, young, crew-cut, the particular lean-faced look of someone who ran excessively, looked at Avery when she appeared and said, "You Cross?" "Yes." He looked at her for a second in the way that said he'd been told something about her on the drive-in and was currently reconciling that information with the reality of a woman with a cut on her face and mud on her jacket standing in front of him. Whatever he'd been told, she hadn't looked like this in the telling of it. "The sergeant major is going to want to talk to you," he said. "He can talk to me when Drake is on the aircraft." The operator blinked. That's not really—" "When Drake is on the aircraft," Avery said again, in the same tone, and crouched in front of Vren. He looked at her with the flat professional assessment of someone who had accepted the current situation without abandoning his capacity to evaluate it. "You came back," he said. "I have questions." "I know." He shifted his back against the pine root. His right arm was held close to his body, the field dressing visible below his sleeve. "The eighth." She didn't respond to that. She let the silence sit. "There was an eighth position," Vren said. "Northern Ridge. He wasn't part of the primary ambush element. He was holding in reserve, backup extraction, and secondary coverage if the primary element was compromised." A pause. "Which it was." "Where is he now?" "When the primary engagement started going wrong, his orders were to extract. He's been gone for 25 minutes minimum. Heading northeast. He'll have a vehicle staged on the logging road." He looked at her steadily. "He's gone. He was always the extraction element. His job was to leave." Avery was quiet for a moment, running the geometry. "He watched," she said. It wasn't a question. Vren's expression shifted slightly. The first real shift she'd seen from him. "Yes," he said. "He watched. He has eyes on everything that happened in this forest today." Vren didn't answer that, which was an answer. She stood up. The QRF operator was watching her with the uncertain expression of someone trying to figure out if he was supposed to be doing something. "I need a vehicle and someone who knows the logging road network northeast of this grid," she said. "I can't authorize, then find me someone who can." She was already moving. "Now, the vehicle first." The sergeant major's name was Theo Gallagher, and he was the kind of military senior NCO who had been doing the job long enough that the job had settled into his face and his posture and the specific way he stood in a clearing looking at a pile of evidence that didn't match any predictive model he'd worked from. He was 51 years old, built like a man who'd been durable rather than spectacular, and had never needed to be spectacular, and he had the patience of someone who had waited out better situations than this one. He was looking at the ridge when Avery found him. Not at the bodies. The QRF was already processing those, photographing positions, logging trajectories, doing the meticulous work of intelligence documentation that turned a combat outcome into actionable information. He was looking at the positions themselves, the way they were built, the angles, the geometry of a sniper network that had been constructed with very serious intent by very serious people. He heard her coming and turned before she spoke. The cut on her face was still bleeding slightly, which Barrow had declared low priority when Avery had refused to sit still long enough to close it properly. "Cross," he said. Sergeant Major. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of someone who was choosing their opening carefully. Drake's on the aircraft, he said. Good. Flight surgeon says he'll make it. Chest wound, but the seal held. He paused. Barrow did good work. She did. So did someone else. Avery didn't respond to that. Gallagher looked back at the ridge, at one of the confirmed positions, a hide built in the fork of a pine approximately 9 feet off the ground, the kind of position you wouldn't find unless you knew where to look, and even then, only if you knew what you were looking at. Counter-sniper doctrine, he said, working the topology instead of tracking by movement. It's what the terrain required. It's also classified curriculum. He said it without emphasis. Just said it. Counter-sniper program, JCSP variant. The approach, the movement pattern, the way the hides were identified from terrain analysis rather than visual tracking. He turned to look at her again. I've seen that methodology twice before. Once in a training evaluation and once in an after-action review I was read into under a clearance I don't hold anymore. Silence. You're going to want to tell me something, she said. I'm going to want to ask you something. He turned to face her fully. Who are you? The words came out even and unhurried, not aggressive, not rhetorical. A genuine question from a man who had been doing this long enough to recognize when he'd been standing in the same room as something he didn't have the category for. Avery looked at him. The cut on her jaw was still bleeding. I'm a specialist attached to 3rd Reconnaissance, she said. That's your file answer. That's the accurate answer. Gallagher held the look for 3 long seconds. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He smiled. Not widely. A small, tired, genuine thing that said he appreciated the precision of the non-answer, even as he recognized it for what it was. Okay, he said. We'll get to the other question eventually. He turned back to the ridge. The prisoner. He's talking? Confirmed 8th position, extraction element, staged vehicle northeast on the logging road. He's been gone too long to catch, but the vehicle location might give us something. Our sweep found tire tracks at the logging road junction 2 clicks northeast. Vehicle gone. Probably a 40-minute head start. He clasped his hands behind his back, the habitual posture of a man thinking with his hands occupied. Coordinator names? He gave me Vren. Elias Vren. Nothing matching in the current files. Current files aren't complete. He said this with a weight that suggested he was not speaking generally. There's a classification tier above what 3rd Reconnaissance operates in, and in that tier there are names that don't appear in the files your unit has access to. He paused. Vren is one of them. Avery was very still. You know him, she said. I know of him, and I know of the network he works for. And I know, now, that this ambush was not a random interdiction of a recon element operating near the frontier. He turned to look at her, and his expression had settled into something she recognized. The particular flatness of a senior operator who has arrived at a conclusion he doesn't like and is proceeding with it anyway. This was a targeted operation. Someone knew your squad would be in this forest today. The words landed in the cold air and didn't move. That information would have come from the mission brief, she said. The mission brief was distributed to 8 people at 3 command levels, one of whom provided it to Vren's network. Yes. He said it cleanly. No dramatic inflation, just the fact stated. Which means we have a compromise at command level, and we have a dead sniper network in this forest. And we have 1 prisoner and 1 disappeared extraction element who watched everything that happened here today. Avery processed this, the logging road, the staged vehicle, the 8th position that had sat north and watched and then driven away. He saw the methodology, she said. Yes. Everything I did today is now documented by whoever he reports to. Yes. Gallagher looked at her steadily. And whoever he reports to is sophisticated enough to plan an operation like this one, which means they're sophisticated enough to analyze a counter-sniper engagement and draw conclusions about the training program that produced it. He didn't say what those conclusions would lead to. He didn't have to. Avery looked at the ridge, at the hide positions, at the falling afternoon light in the pines. She'd spent 2 years in a program that didn't officially exist, training against opponents that didn't officially exist, in locations that weren't officially acknowledged. The entire architecture of that time was built on obscurity. Not secrecy exactly. Secrecy implied paperwork and classification tiers. Obscurity. the absence of evidence specific enough to be identified. She'd walked into Blackwood Forest as a quiet operator nobody believed in, and she'd walked out as the woman who'd dismantled a professional 8-person sniper network in under 30 minutes. The eighth man had watched. The eighth man had driven away. And now someone, somewhere, was going to look at the footage, or the report, or the description and start asking the question Vren had asked from the mud. Who trained you? Gallagher was watching her process this. You should have run, maybe, he said, not unkindly. Kept your head down, let the situation develop. Drake would have died. I know. A pause. I'm not criticizing. I'm contextualizing. He let the silence hold for a moment. There are people above my clearance level who are going to want to talk to you. That's going to happen regardless of what we do in the next hour. What I can control is the shape of the conversation when it does. What does that mean? It means I need you to tell me something true before anyone else starts asking questions, because the way this goes into the official record matters, and the official record is going to be written in the next 6 hours, whether you participate in writing it or not. He held her gaze. Who trained you? Not where. Not when. Who? The pines shifted in a wind that hadn't been there a minute ago. A long silence. The program was called SOLACE, she said. It cost her something to say it. Not dramatically. Not the way things cost you in movies, with visible anguish and trembling voices. It cost her the way privacy costs when you trade it for necessity. A quiet subtraction. Counter-sniper identification and elimination. 2 years, operational, not theoretical. The instructors didn't use names. The missions didn't go into standard after-action files. She paused. I was the third candidate to complete the full curriculum. The first 2 didn't make it through the final operational evaluation. Gallagher was very still. Didn't make it through, he said. The evaluation was live, she said. The opposition was live. He absorbed this with the face of someone who had heard genuinely difficult information before and had learned to receive it without visible reaction, and who was currently working very hard at that skill. How many missions in the program? 41 over 22 months. Against? Variously. State-sponsored elements. Non-state specialist contractors. 2 who were former SOLACE adjacent trained. You hunted other counter-sniper trained operators. Yes. Gallagher breathed out through his nose. And then you asked for reassignment to a standard reconnaissance unit, he said. Yes. Why? The question sat there, simple and direct and carrying more weight than its 3 letters suggested. Avery looked at the cut on her palm where she'd caught a root wrong in the ridge scramble earlier. It was a small cut, just the kind of minor damage that accumulated in the field and didn't rise to the level of requiring attention. 41 missions, she said. I was 27 years old. She looked at him. I wanted to be part of something that didn't disappear afterward. Gallagher was quiet for a long moment. I can work with that, he said finally. The record, I mean. It's not the whole truth, but it's true enough that it doesn't become a problem later. There's still the question of the 8th man. There is. And the compromise at command level. That's being handled. He said it in a way that foreclosed further discussion. Not aggressively, just with the finality of someone for whom handled was a professional rather than a rhetorical term. Avery nodded. They stood at the base of the ridge in the early dark of an overcast October afternoon, the mist moving between them and the trees, and the sound of the QRF working the forest floor somewhere to their north was the only thing breaking the silence now. Then a radio crackled. One of the QRF operators, voice-controlled but with something underneath it that wasn't quite controlled. Sergeant Major, we need you at the north perimeter. Gallagher keyed his handset. What is it? We found something, sir, on the ridge. A pause. You're going to want to see it yourself. They went. The north perimeter was where the ridge curved east and dropped toward the forest floor, and it was there, in a shallow depression behind an old pine, with a commanding view back through the trees toward where First Squad had held their defensive position, that the 8th man had sat. The position was neat, organized in the way that trained people organize a hide, everything deliberate, nothing left by accident. Brass from a non-military caliber rifle, swept to one side. Boot prints in the mud, large, regular spacing, pointing northeast toward the logging road. A A small optical tripod impression in the soft earth, 2 legs, where a spotting scope had been set. All of this was expected. What was not expected was the item sitting in the center of the depression, positioned with obvious deliberateness on a cleared section of ground. It was a radio handset. Military pattern, encrypted, the kind that didn't appear in civilian markets. Sitting clean on the mud, not dropped, not lost. Placed. With the care of someone making a point, Gallagher crouched beside it without touching it. The QRF operator who'd made the call was standing back, giving space. "It's been sanitized," the operator said. "No prints, no ID markings, nothing. Our signals guys say it's a type not currently in our inventory." Gallagher looked at it for a long moment. "It's a message," Avery said. She was standing slightly behind him, looking at the handset with the expression of someone who recognizes a language they hadn't expected to encounter here. "He's telling us he could have called in and adjusted fire, could have given position coordinates while the engagement was ongoing." She paused. "He watched everything and he chose not to act." "Why would he choose not to act?" the operator said. Neither Gallagher nor Avery answered him immediately. Gallagher picked up the handset with a gloved hand, turned it over. Nothing on any surface. Clean plastic and metal and silence. "What frequency?" he said to the signals tech who'd been called up. The tech checked, looked at his own equipment, looked at Gallagher. "It's programmed, sir," the tech said. "1 channel, already set." He hesitated. "It's been transmitting a carrier signal for approximately 20 minutes. Carrier signal, meaning someone is listening for a transmission on the other end. The forest was very quiet. Avery was looking at the handset in Gallagher's hand, and her expression had gone somewhere that wasn't readable, exactly. But Gallagher had been doing this long enough to recognize the particular quality of a person receiving information that rearranges something fundamental. "He wants you to call him," Gallagher said. He wasn't speaking to himself. He was speaking to Avery. She looked at the handset. "Not me," she said. "Me, specifically." "That's my read." SOLACE appeared at the edge of the position. He'd followed from the main element, inseparably curious in the way that had defined him throughout this entire afternoon. He looked at the handset, looked at the two of them, opened his mouth. Reyes appeared beside him and put a hand on his shoulder, and SOLACE closed his mouth. The carrier signal continued its patient, silent transmission into the October dark. Gallagher held the handset out toward Avery. She looked at it for 4 full seconds. "Whatever he says," Gallagher said, "it goes into an official record. Whatever he tells you becomes part of the operational picture. You understand what that means." "It means I'm not a quiet operator anymore." "No," Gallagher said. "You haven't been that since the first shot." She took the handset. She pressed transmit. She said in a voice that was completely level, "This is Cross." The carrier signal held for 2 seconds. Then a voice came back. Not Vren's voice, not the coordinator's damaged, careful English, but a different voice entirely. Measured, patient, with the specific quality of someone who speaks knowing their words will be replayed and analyzed and who has chosen every syllable accordingly. "Specialist Cross," the voice said. "I've been looking for you for 8 months." The pine trees stood in the darkening afternoon, holding whatever they knew about this, which was everything. Avery's hand was steady on the handset. Her thumb stayed on the transmit key. "You have the wrong person," she said. A pause. "We both know that's not true," the voice said. "SOLACE produced 3 graduates. I trained the first 2. The silence that followed had a different texture than all the other silences in Blackwood Forest that day. Gallagher's face had gone completely still. The signals tech had stopped breathing. The voice continued, patient and even and absolutely certain of itself. "The program ended for reasons you were never told. I think it's time you understood why. And I think you're going to want to hear what I have to say before anyone in that clearing with you starts writing their reports." The carrier signal held under his voice like a floor. Avery's jaw was tight. The cut on her face had dried into a thin, dark line. "You have 30 seconds to decide," the voice said, "whether you trust the people standing next to you or whether you trust what you know." The handset was solid and cold in her grip. 28 seconds, 27, 27 seconds. Avery's thumb stayed on the transmit key, and the carrier signal hummed beneath the voice's last sentence like a road running somewhere she hadn't agreed to go yet. She looked at Gallagher. He was watching her with the expression of a man who had just heard something that rearranged the furniture of a room he thought he knew, and who was being very careful not to show how much rearranging was happening. His eyes went briefly to the handset, then back to her face. "Your call," he said, quiet enough that it didn't carry. She looked at the signals tech, who was staring at his equipment with the focused intensity of someone who very badly wanted to be looking anywhere other than the conversation happening 2 feet away from him. She looked at Reyes, who had come forward when the carrier signal activated and was standing at the edge of the position with his rifle at low ready and an expression that said he didn't have enough context to know what he was looking at, but was prepared to respond to it when he did. 22 seconds. The voice had said, "Trust what you know." What she knew was this: Gallagher was not the source of the compromise. His reaction to the word solace had been the reaction of a man genuinely encountering that information for the first time. You couldn't fake the specific stillness that had come over his face. She'd spent 2 years reading people in situations where misreading them was a terminal error, and Gallagher was not performing surprise, which meant the compromise was above him, which meant the people who would write the official record were not necessarily the people she wanted writing it, which was exactly what the voice wanted her to think. She was aware of that. She held both things simultaneously: the logic the voice was offering, and the fact that the voice was offering it for reasons she didn't yet understand. Intelligence was always competing architectures. Someone gave you information to build a structure that served them, and the skill was in identifying the foundation before you moved in. 15 seconds. She pressed transmit. "I'm here," she said. "Talk." The carrier signal shifted fractionally, the sound of someone at the other end adjusting their position, settling in. "The program ended in February 18 months ago," the voice said. "Official reason: budget restructuring, operational redundancy. Those were the words in the termination document." A pause. "The actual reason is that SOLACE produced a capability that certain people decided was more valuable as a private asset than a military one." Gallagher's jaw had tightened. "Who are you?" Avery said. "My name is Calder. I was the program architect for SOLACE from its inception. I designed the curriculum, I selected the candidates, I ran the operational evaluations." Another pause. "I was the one who signed off on your graduation." The pine trees stood in the dark and the cold and said nothing. "Calder," she said. The name didn't match any face she could access. SOLACE's instructors had operated without names, without visible identity, exactly as she'd told Gallagher. She had spent 2 years training under people whose faces she knew and whose names she had never been given. "Prove it." A silence. Then, "Your final evaluation. 41 operational missions total. The last one in a coastal environment you were told was a training scenario. The opposing element was 3 trained contractors. You identified the second one by a thermal signature anomaly in a window that shouldn't have had heat because the building had been abandoned for 6 weeks. You held the shot for 11 minutes, waiting for a clean angle." She said nothing. "You didn't take the shot," Calder said. "The opposing element surrendered the position when they lost contact with their coordinator. You reported the outcome as a successful evaluation completion. What you didn't report, what I found in a secondary review of the scenario footage, was that you had a clean shot at the third contractor from minute 4 onward and chose not to take it." Avery was still. "I never asked you why," Calder said. "I should have. I think about it occasionally." "It was a training scenario," she said. "You don't take clean shots on training contractors when the evaluation can be completed without it. The evaluation criteria didn't specify that condition." "No," she said. "They didn't." A brief silence. "That's why you graduated," Calder said. "The first 2 candidates completed every evaluation by the strictest available interpretation of success. You completed them by the most limited application of necessary force." He paused. "I designed the program to produce the first type. I should have designed it to produce the second." Gallagher was looking at her sideways. His expression said he was listening to half a conversation and building the other half from what he could see on her face, which was nothing, because she'd learned to keep her face from being readable in exactly these situations, and the skill was automatic now. "What do you want?" Avery said. "Vren's network has a client. The network doesn't plan operations like today's on their own initiative. They're contractors. Someone with access to your unit's mission brief hired them. That same client is the person who negotiated the private acquisition of SOLACE's methodology 18 months ago. The program compromise and the command compromise are the same source. Yes. And the ambush today was targeted at you specifically, not at First Squad, at the trained asset that someone's intelligence picture told them was attached to First Squad under cover of a standard reconnaissance assignment. Calder's voice was even throughout. No dramatic inflation, just information delivered at the pace of someone who had organized it beforehand. They didn't know what they were sending Vren's team into. They knew you had Solace training. They didn't know what that meant operationally because the classified summary they accessed described outcomes without methodology. Avery processed this. "Who is the client?" she said. "A man named Driscoll, Deputy Director of Signals Intelligence, Ravinia Combined Command. He has the clearance level to have accessed the mission brief and the financial relationships to have hired Vren's network." A pause. "He also has a personal reason to want Solace's capability eliminated. His son was the opposing contractor in your final evaluation, the one you chose not to shoot." The carrier signal held steady under the silence. Gallagher had stopped pretending to look anywhere except directly at Avery. She lowered the handset for a moment, looked at Gallagher. "Driscoll," she said. "Not a question." Gallagher's expression confirmed it without confirming it. A micro-movement of his jaw, a tightening at the corners of his eyes that said the name had a specific weight he'd been carrying. She raised the handset again. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because Driscoll is going to be part of the debrief process. Because the official record being written in the next 6 hours is going to pass through his office for classification review. And because if you walk into that debrief without understanding the architecture of what happened today, the record will be written in a way that protects him and buries everything else." A pause. "Including you. And what does telling me this accomplish for you?" "I built Solace," Calder said. "Someone dismantled it and sold the pieces. I have an interest in that being corrected." "That's not an answer to my question." Another silence, longer this time. "No," Calder said. "It isn't." The carrier signal continued. "There is documentation," Calder said finally. "Financial transfers, communication intercepts, the acquisition agreement itself. It exists in a format that doesn't require my testimony and doesn't require yours. It requires someone with the correct clearance to know where to look." A pause. "Gallagher has that clearance." Avery looked at Gallagher. Gallagher looked back at her with the expression of someone who was making a series of rapid calculations and was not entirely pleased with where they were landing. "He says you have the clearance," she said, holding the handset so Gallagher could hear. Gallagher held out his hand. She gave him the handset. "Calder," Gallagher said. His voice had the specific tone of a senior NCO who has been briefed on something that falls outside his official lane and is currently deciding how far outside that lane he's willing to operate. "I know that name from a file I was read into 4 years ago. You're listed as deceased." "That was deliberate," Calder said. "Driscoll arranged it when he began the acquisition process. A deceased program architect can't object to the program's repurposing. The documentation you mentioned, server location, access protocol, and authentication key. I'll transmit them to this handset in 30 seconds. What you do with them is your decision." A pause. "But if you don't move on Driscoll before the debrief, he will move on Cross. And the record will reflect that an unsanctioned operator exceeded her operational authority during a recon mission, which is a career-ending characterization at minimum and a criminal one at maximum." Gallagher pressed the handset against his thigh and looked at the pine trees for 3 seconds. "Is he telling the truth?" he said to Avery. "I don't know," she said. "I don't know Calder. I know what he knows about the program, which is things that shouldn't be accessible if he wasn't who he says he is. But I don't know his motivation, and I don't know what the documentation actually says." "Best guess." She thought about it. About Vren in the mud asking who trained you with the face of a professional who had been sent into a situation he hadn't been accurately briefed on. About a targeted ambush designed to eliminate a specific asset rather than destroy a recon element. About the 8th man sitting north and watching everything and then leaving a radio handset on the ground. "He watched today's engagement," she said. "If his goal was to protect Driscoll, he could have intervened. He didn't." She paused. The handset was a message saying he could have and chose not to. Gallagher looked at her for a long moment. Then he raised the handset. Transmit the location, he said. The debrief was held at Forward Operating Base Krenner, 40 kilometers south of Blackwood Forest, in a room that was officially a conference facility and was in practice the kind of room where things got decided in ways that the official record would describe differently. It had a long table, 8 chairs, fluorescent lights that had never quite been set to a comfortable brightness, and a smell of industrial coffee, and too many people making important decisions in a confined space. Avery sat on one side of the table, alone. Across from her sat 3 people. A colonel named Hess, who ran the Ravinia Northern Command and had the look of a man who had driven 4 hours to attend a meeting he hadn't expected to need to attend and was not handling the surprise well. Beside him, a civilian intelligence coordinator named Falk, wire-rimmed glasses, the particular pallor of someone who worked in rooms without natural light. And at the end of the table, with the composed, deliberate posture of a man who had decided exactly how he intended to conduct himself before walking through the door, Deputy Director Driscoll. He was 55, gray at the temples, the kind of professionally distinguished that came from spending decades in rooms like this one. He had the relaxed authority of someone who knew exactly how much power he had in this room and didn't need to demonstrate it, because demonstration was for people who were uncertain about it. He looked at Avery with an expression of polite professional interest that she recognized as the expression of someone performing polite professional interest. Gallagher was not in the room. Gallagher was in another room, doing something with a clearance Avery didn't have, and the nature of what he was doing was visible to her only in the controlled urgency she'd seen in his face when he'd received the transmission from Calder's handset and looked at what it contained. He'd looked at it for 4 seconds. Then he'd said, "Get in the vehicle." And they'd driven to Phobe Krenner with a speed that said the 4 seconds had told him something significant. She didn't know yet whether what Gallagher was doing would matter before this debrief ended. She was sitting in the room and operating as though it wouldn't, because that was the safer frame. Colonel Hess opened with the standard language. Mission overview, contact report, casualty status, enemy element assessment. His tone was the tone of someone reading from a script he hadn't fully internalized, which meant the script had been given to him recently rather than developed organically. Avery answered the factual questions factually. Drake's status. Barrow's medical response. The radio communications with command. The timeline. Falk asked about the sniper methodology. His tone was clinical and curious in the way that intelligence professionals are curious. Not personal, not impressed, just data gathering. "Walk me through the engagement sequence," Falk said. She walked through it, concisely. First position, first target acquisition, the 2-shot initial sequence, the repositioning pattern, the methodology of working topology rather than tracking by movement. "Where did you learn counter-sniper methodology of that specific type?" Falk said. "Prior assignment," she said. "What assignment?" "Classified. Above the documentation level accessible to this debrief." Falk looked at Hess. Hess looked at his notes. The notes said something that required a pause before responding. Driscoll spoke for the first time. Specialist Cross. His voice was exactly as measured as it had been in her head since Calder named him. "The operational outcome today was exceptional. Nobody in this room is disputing that." He leaned forward slightly, just slightly, with the posture of a man establishing warmth rather than pressure. "But exceptional outcomes that exceed documented capability profiles create administrative problems. Do you understand what I mean? You're saying my personnel file doesn't explain today," she said. "Your personnel file, as I have reviewed it, documents standard reconnaissance qualification, above-average marksmanship certification, and 6 months of uneventful unit integration." He spread his hands in a gesture of professional regret. "Nothing in that file explains the elimination of 8 professional contractors with 0 friendly casualties in approximately 30 minutes. 7, she said. 7 confirmed. The 8th extracted before I could locate him." 7, Driscoll said, conceding the correction with the ease of someone who considered it unimportant. "Which raises the question of what's actually in your file versus what should be." She looked at him. "What should be," she said, "is the accurate record of my prior assignment, which was classified above the level your office has access to." Something moved in Driscoll's eyes. Small. Gone immediately. "My office has access to all active and inactive personnel files within the Northern Command structure," he said. Not all of them, she said. Silence. Hess shifted in his chair. Falk looked between them with the expression of someone at a tennis match who is now uncertain about the score. Driscoll held her gaze with the patience of a man who is very good at waiting. "What are you suggesting?" he said. "I'm not suggesting anything," she said. "I'm stating that the prior assignment documentation which would explain today's operational outcome exists at a classification level above what you've described having access to. If such documentation existed, I would have access to it." "That's an assumption," she said, "not a fact." The fluorescent lights did their humming thing. The coffee smell intensified when nobody moved. Driscoll's expression hadn't changed. That was the tell. A man genuinely confident in his position would have shown some fraction of irritation at being contradicted by a specialist in a debrief room. The fact that his expression didn't change said the absence of irritation was managed. He was performing calm the same way she was performing certainty. They were both waiting for the same thing. The door opened. Gallagher came in. Not alone. Behind him was a woman Avery didn't recognize, mid-50s, civilian clothes, the specific posture of someone who walked into rooms expecting the room to reconfigure around her arrival. Behind the woman was a uniformed officer with 3 stars on his collar, whose name Avery didn't know, but whose rank meant he outranked everyone in this room, except possibly the woman. Hess stood up immediately. Driscoll stood up more slowly. The slowness was controlled, but it was there. "General," Hess said, "we weren't—" "Sit down, Randall," the general said, in the tone of someone who has known Hess long enough to use his first name and considers the standing unnecessary. Hess sat. The woman sat without introduction at the end of the table opposite Driscoll. She put a tablet on the table in front of her, screen face down. She looked at Avery once, briefly, with an expression that gave nothing away, and then looked at Driscoll. "Marcus," she said. "Director," Driscoll said. His voice was precisely the same, every syllable exactly calibrated. "I've spent the last 40 minutes reviewing some materials that were forwarded to my office by Sergeant Major Gallagher." She didn't turn the tablet over. "Materials relating to financial transactions, specifically wire transfers from an account registered to a shell entity in Portheim to the operating account of a private contractor network known to use the organizational name Vren." Driscoll said nothing. "Materials relating to a private acquisition agreement dated February 18 months ago, covering the methodology documentation of a classified military program." She paused. "And materials relating to a command-level compromise, specifically the unauthorized forwarding of a mission brief to a non-authorized recipient traced through a secure server log to a terminal in this building." The fluorescent lights hummed. "Marcus," the director said, "would you like to say something before this goes any further?" The room held its breath. Driscoll looked at the table for exactly 2 seconds. Then he looked up at the director. "I want legal representation before any further discussion," he said. "Of course you do," the director said. She turned the tablet over, screen up, set it in the center of the table where everyone could see it. The screen showed a summary document, transaction records, a brief, and at the bottom a photograph. The photograph was a screen grab from a security camera, timestamp at the top, showing a corridor that Avery recognized as the type of corridor common to command facilities. The figure in the corridor was Driscoll. The timestamp was from the day before yesterday. "You'll be escorted," the director said to Driscoll. "Professionally, no spectacle." 2 uniformed MPs appeared at the door with the timing of people who had been waiting in the corridor and had been given a signal she hadn't visibly made. Driscoll stood. He picked up the jacket he'd draped over his chair with the specific care of a man maintaining his presentation until the last available moment. He looked at Avery once. She met his look. His face said nothing that she could read. Not rage, not fear, not the specific quality of exposed guilt. Just the controlled professional neutrality of a man who had been in rooms like this for 30 years and knew how to wear his face in them. He went with the MPs. The door closed. Colonel Hess had the look of a man who had attended what he thought was a debrief and had instead attended a significant institutional event he had no framework for. "Falk," the general said, "step out." Falk stepped out without protest, which said he'd recognized the room had reconfigured. The director looked at Avery. "SOLACE," the director said, "you're the 3rd graduate." "Yes," Avery said. "Tell me about today." So she did. She started from the moment Drake's hand signal went up and the forest changed quality. She told it chronologically and without decoration. The first position, the sequence, the repositioning pattern, Vren, the coordinator at the ridge, the conversation on the handset. The director listened without interrupting. The general took notes on a small paper pad with a pen, which was the kind of anachronism that very senior people sometimes maintained because it left no digital trace. When she finished, the director was quiet for a moment. Calder, the director said. He says he built the program. He did build the program. He also disappeared 18 months ago in circumstances that were, at the time, attributed to a vehicle accident. A pause. We now understand that differently. He said the accident was arranged. We believe that's correct. The director looked at her steadily. He's been operating outside institutional channels for 18 months, which makes him technically a non-sanctioned actor. He gave us the documentation that identified Driscoll. Yes. Another pause. People operating outside institutional channels can still do useful things. That's what makes them complicated. She looked at Avery with the measuring quality of someone conducting an assessment. He contacted you specifically. He contacted the handset. He knew I'd be the one using it. He knows your work. He designed your curriculum. The director leaned back slightly, which raises the question of what he wants from you going forward. Avery thought about this. He said he had an interest in the program's private repurposing being corrected, she said. He didn't define what that correction looks like. No, he wouldn't. The director's expression was the expression of someone who had had previous dealings with Calder that informed this assessment. He builds things and then he monitors them. The program, the graduates, the methodology. He has a proprietary relationship with his own work. She paused. Which means he'll want to know where you go from here. Where do I go from here? Avery said. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical. The room was quiet enough that the distinction was clear. The general stopped writing. The director looked at her for a long moment. That depends on what you want, the director said, which is a question I imagine nobody has asked you recently. Avery was quiet. What she wanted had been a complicated calculation for a long time. She'd wanted to be part of something that didn't disappear afterward, which was what she'd told Gallagher, and which was true as far as it went. But the wanting was more specific than that. She'd wanted to be useful in a way that didn't require her to be invisible. She'd spent 2 years as a ghost and 6 months as a woman nobody believed in, and both of those were different versions of the same erasure. I want the record corrected, she said. Drake's unit took an ambush that was targeted at me. His people have a right to know what they actually walked into today. That will be handled, the director said, and I want to continue working. In what capacity? Something where I don't have to pretend I'm less than I am to make other people comfortable. The director looked at her with something that might have been approval or might have been the professional analog of it, which was not the same thing but was close enough to be meaningful. That's an honest answer, the director said. I've been doing this long enough to be tired of the other kind, Avery said. Gallagher, standing at the edge of the room near the door, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was in that neighborhood. The general glanced at him. Gallagher straightened. The prisoner, the director said. Vren. He'll talk, Avery said. Not because he's broken. He isn't. Because the architecture he was working inside has collapsed, and he's a professional who understands when the contract terms have changed. He'll want something in exchange. What will he want? He'll want to know who sold him bad intelligence about what he was walking into today. He was told he was sending a team against a standard recon element. She paused. He lost 8 people. That's personal even when it's professional. The director made a note. Not on the tablet. On a small card she produced from her jacket pocket. Old-fashioned in the same way the general's notepad was old-fashioned. Cross, the director said. Ma'am? The cut on your face needs to be closed. Avery's hand went to her jaw. She'd forgotten about it. The blood had dried, which meant it had been bleeding and stopping and bleeding again for the past several hours. Barrow's with the QRF element, Avery said. I know where Barrow is. I know where everyone in this building is. The director said it without emphasis. Go find her. We'll continue this when you've had the cut looked at and something to eat. It was a dismissal, but not an unkind one. Avery stood. She picked up her jacket from the chair back. She looked at the general, who looked up from his pad and gave her a nod that was brief and genuine. She looked at the director one more time. The handset, she said. Calder's frequency. He's still listening. I know, the director said. Leave it with Gallagher. Avery left it with Gallagher. He took it without comment and turned it over in his hands once, looking at it with the expression of a man who was adding this to a mental file that had gotten considerably larger in the past 3 hours. Cross, he said. She stopped at the door. That thing Drake said? When we were still in the forest. She waited. He said, I should have listened to her earlier. Gallagher held the handset. Just so you know, someone said it out loud. She looked at him for a moment. How is he? She said. Out of surgery. Flight surgeon says the chest seal held well enough that the lung involvement was minimal. He'll be down for 6 weeks minimum. A pause. He's already arguing about it. She nodded. Something in her face moved slightly and then went back to where it had been. Good, she said. She went to find Barrow. The corridor outside the debrief room was the institutional gray of every military corridor in every facility she'd ever been in, and it smelled the same as all of them. Cleaning compound and recycled air, and the specific scent of infrastructure that had been functional for so long, it had forgotten it was supposed to seem welcoming. She walked it alone. At the far end, through a door that opened onto a small exterior space, concrete, a bench, a view of the vehicle pool, and past it the dark hills that held Blackwood Forest somewhere in their distance, she found Reyes. He was sitting on the bench with his elbows on his knees and a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He looked up when she came through the door. They looked at each other. Drake's out of surgery, she said. I know, Mendez called. He looked at the coffee. You okay? Cut on my face. Looking for Barrow. She's in the medical bay with the prisoner. He paused. She volunteered to monitor his arm after they said it. Wouldn't let the facility medic do it alone. He said it the way you say something that tells you more about a person than you expected. Avery sat on the other end of the bench. The vehicle pool was quiet. Someone was running a maintenance check on a truck at the far end, the sound of an engine being cycled through its gears carrying faintly in the cold night air. Vega wants to know what happened, Reyes said. Vega's in the medical bay 2 doors down from Drake. His shoulder's fine. Satcom took the hit worse than he did. A pause. He wants to know what happened out there. What have you told him? Nothing. He looked at the hills. I don't have a way to explain it that doesn't sound like... I don't know what it sounds like. He stopped. You were next to last in our formation. Nobody ever put you anywhere near point. Vega called you the maybe. He said it with the flatness of someone stating an injustice they were complicit in. And you walked into that forest and came back out, and the forest was different. She didn't answer that. You could have told us, he said. Not accusatory. More like tired. What you were. What you knew. I didn't want to be what I was, she said. I wanted to be on a team. The sentence sat there. Reyes turned the coffee cup in his hands. You are on a team, he said. She looked at him. Whatever happens next, he said. Whatever that debrief decided. You came back out of the trees and the score was 7-0, and Drake is in a room 2 floors up having an argument with a flight surgeon about his recovery timeline. He shrugged, a small movement that carried more weight than its size suggested. That's the team. That's what it means. The engine in the vehicle pool cycled down. The cold settled in around them, the specific cold of a high-altitude night in a country that sat on the uncomfortable edge of a conflict that didn't have clean names yet. Vega should know, she said. What happened? A version of it. I'll tell him the version, Reyes said. You want to be there? No. He nodded, accepted it. The cut on your jaw looks bad, he said. I know. Barrow's going to give you a hard time about letting it go this long. I know that too. She stood up. He stayed on the bench. Cross, he said. She stopped. When they sort out whatever they're sorting out in there, he gestured with the coffee cup toward the building behind them. You're still on the team, whatever that looks like from here. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went inside to find Barrow. Barrow was exactly where Reyes said she'd be. The medical bay at FOB Krenner had 6 beds, 4 of which were occupied, and the one nearest the door held Vren, arms set, dressed, his wrist no longer secured to anything because the facility had a locked ward protocol that made the flex cuff redundant. He was awake. Barrow was seated beside him with the chart balanced on her knee, checking the dressing with the professional focus she brought to everything, which was complete and unsentimental, and somehow also decent. She was a medic who had learned that the body requiring care didn't change based on whose body it was. Vren watched her work with the flat assessment he'd had since the forest. He looked up when Avery came through the door. Barrow looked up too. "Sit," Barrow said immediately and without preamble. You need to sit down and let me close that cut before it scars badly. Sit." Avery sat in the chair across from Vren's bed. Barrow moved to her without ceremony, pulling a suture kit from the tray beside her, examining the cut along Avery's jaw with the same professional attention she'd given Vren's arm dressing. "This has been open 6 hours," Barrow said. "I know. It's going to leave a mark regardless." "I know that too." Barrow began cleaning the cut. The antiseptic was cold and the sting was real, and Avery held still in the way that she'd learned to hold still a long time ago, which was by finding something to look at and not moving anything above the neck. She looked at Vren. "The director is going to want to talk to you," she said. "I know." He watched Barrow work for a moment. "The deputy director. He's been removed." Something shifted in Vren's expression. Small, but present. "Removed," he said. "Arrested. Tonight." A silence. Barrow applied the first suture with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this in conditions considerably worse than a lit medical bay and found the current conditions almost comfortable by comparison. "We were told the target was a trained asset operating under reconnaissance cover," Vren said. "Standard extraction. Remove the asset, make it look like an ambush casualty. Contained. Professional." His jaw tightened slightly. "We were not told what kind of training. Would it have changed your answer?" He considered this with what looked like genuine thought rather than performance. "Yes," he said. "Not on principle. On arithmetic." He looked at his arm. 8 people. Barrow's hands paused for exactly 1 second and then continued. 8 people, Avery said. "It was bad information," he said. "Deliberately bad." He looked at her. "That's a specific kind of breach. In my work, bad information that gets your team killed it's not a contract dispute. It's a different category. He sold you an incomplete picture to get an outcome he couldn't get through official channels." "Yes." His voice was even. "And then his asset watched and reported what happened and went back and told him what an incomplete picture cost." He paused. "Which is why I left the handset." She looked at him. "You knew we'd use it to find Calder," she said. "I knew you'd use it to find whoever built what you use today, and that person would know where the documentation was." He said it simply. "I wanted Driscoll found. That was the only remaining objective once the operation was finished." Barrow applied the last suture and leaned back to look at her work with the critical expression of someone who knew it was good but didn't feel the need to say so. "Drake's on the 3rd floor," Barrow said, to neither of them specifically. "I know," Avery said. "He's been asking about you since he came out of anesthesia. 3 times now. The night nurse is tired of it." Avery looked at the suture kit on the tray, at her hands, at the thin white bandage on her palm where she'd caught the root wrong on the ridge. "I'll go up," she said. She stood. Vren looked at her one final time with the assessing professional quality that hadn't left him since the forest, and he said the thing she hadn't expected him to say. "You held the shot," he said, "on the ridge. After the near miss, you had a follow-up window and you came down instead." She said nothing. "Why?" he said. It was the same question he'd asked in the forest, the same honest confusion of a professional trying to understand a methodology that didn't match the frame he'd been working in. "Because you were done," she said. "One arm, no rifle, alone. You were done." He held her gaze. "That's an inefficiency," he said. "In my work." "In mine too," she said. "Doesn't mean it's wrong." She left him with that. And with Barrow, who would continue doing her job with the same decency she applied to everything, because that was who Barrow was, and the forest hadn't changed it. Drake's room was small and overlit in the specific way of medical facility rooms, where the lighting seemed designed to prevent any illusion of comfort. He was propped at an angle that the bed's mechanism allowed, which was not quite sitting and not quite lying, and was evidently not satisfying him because the first thing Avery saw when she came through the door was that he'd pushed himself higher than the mechanism supported and was holding himself there with visible effort. He looked pale and tired and annoyed at the degree to which he was pale and tired. "Stop holding yourself up like that," she said. "You'll tear something." "I'm fine." "You had a chest wound 6 hours ago." "I'm aware." He let himself back down against the bed's incline with the careful movement of a man managing real pain and not wanting it to show. He looked at her jaw, at Barrow's sutures. "How many?" "4, it's fine." "Looks worse than fine." "Everything looks worse in this lighting." He was quiet for a moment, studying her the way he'd apparently been studying things from this bed for the past several hours, with the focused attention of a man who had been thinking without the distraction of being upright and operational and responsible for other people. 7, he said. 7 confirmed. The QRF sweep found the 8th position. Nobody home. Tire tracks on the logging road. "I know. Vren confirmed the 8th was extraction only. He's gone." Drake absorbed this. His hand was resting on the bed rail in the careful way of someone for whom the position of their hands had become a significant concern since the surgery. "The debrief," he said. "Handled." "That's not an answer." "It's the accurate answer for what I can tell you right now." She sat in the chair beside his bed. "Driscoll is in custody. The ambush was targeted, not at the squad, at me. The mission brief was compromised at command level." Drake was still. "At me," he repeated. "Yes. My people walked into a targeted operation designed around eliminating you." "Yes." He looked at the ceiling. His jaw was tight. The expression on his face was the expression of a squad leader processing the information that his team's casualties were not random operational bad luck, but the downstream consequence of something he hadn't been told and couldn't have controlled, and finding that information considerably harder to sit with than the alternative. "That's not on you," she said. "I know that." Drake. "I know that." He said it with the controlled force of someone who knew something intellectually and was still working on whether the rest of him agreed. He looked at her. "But I should have read your file." "There wasn't much in my file." "I should have read what was there." He paused. "I made assumptions. We all did. Vega said things." He stopped. "Vega's going to have a conversation about that when he's out of the medical bay." It matters," Drake said. "It matters because it was wrong, and because it cost me information I should have had, and because you've been in this unit 6 months, and I never once asked you to brief me on your prior qualification history." He said it with the directness of a man who had been lying in a hospital bed thinking and had arrived at conclusions he didn't intend to avoid. "That's a leadership failure, mine, and I'm telling you that directly." She looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he repeated, slightly differently. The word of a man who had said the hard thing and found it had landed without drama, which was occasionally how these things went when both people in the room were too tired for anything else. Silence settled. Not uncomfortable, just the silence of two people who had been through a significant day and didn't have the energy for anything that wasn't necessary. "What happens to you now?" Drake said. "The director wants to talk about next assignment." "What do you want?" She looked at her hands, the bandaged palm, the knuckles still carrying traces of forest mud that the facility's sink hadn't fully removed. "I want to train someone," she said. It came out before she'd fully assembled the thought, which meant it had been waiting for a while. "What I know. The methodology. Someone should have it who isn't me." Drake looked at her. "Counter-sniper training," he said. "Modified. For field application without the program structure." She paused. "The program is gone. What it built isn't. Someone should carry it." He was quiet for a moment. "Tell the director that," he said. "I will." "And Cross." He looked at her steadily, the way he'd looked at forest and targets and radio handsets all his career, with the attention of someone who believed that looking carefully at things was the foundation of doing anything correctly. "When I'm out of here, whenever that is, I want you back on the team." She looked at him. The overlit room, the pale walls, the sound of the facility's ventilation system doing its patient work. Outside the narrow window, the hills that held Blackwood Forest somewhere in their dark distance, the pines standing in the cold with whatever they knew about today folded into their bark and their roots, which was everything, and which they would keep for a long time. 6 weeks minimum, she said. The flight surgeon said 6 to 8. Then 8. I'll be here. Something in Drake's face changed. Not dramatically, not with the kind of relief that announced itself, but in the small way that faces change when a person hears the thing they'd been hoping to hear but hadn't known how to ask for. Good, he said. She found Gallagher in the corridor outside the debrief room at midnight. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and the look of a man who had attended a very long day and was still attending it, and who had made his peace with that. He held out the handset. She took it. The director wants it in evidence, he said, but she said you could make one transmission first. Avery looked at the handset. The carrier signal had been continuous for, she counted back, over 6 hours now. Patient and steady, the way Calder had apparently learned to be across 18 months of operating in the dark. She pressed transmit. It's Cross, she said. The carrier signal held, then, I know. His voice was exactly the same as it had been in the forest. How did it go? Driscoll is in custody. The documentation is with the director's office. Good. The director knows you're alive. I expected that. She'll want to find you. I know. A pause. Are you all right? The question came out differently than everything else he'd said. Less organized. More like something that had escaped rather than been released. I'm all right, she said. The program, what you did today. It was exactly what it was designed to produce. Another pause. I should tell you that I didn't design it to be used the way Driscoll tried to use it. I designed it to protect people. I know, she said. I could tell. It's in this methodology, the application of minimum necessary force. She paused. You built that in. Silence on the carrier. You noticed, he said. It took me a while, she said. But yes. A longer silence this time. I'll find the director when I'm ready, Calder said. Tell her that, on my terms and on my timeline, not before. I'll tell her. Cross. Yes. The third candidate who didn't graduate. A pause. She's teaching primary school in this capital. She doesn't know she's being watched over. A pause that carried its own weight. Someone should tell her she can stop looking over her shoulder. Driscoll's arrangement included her name as a secondary target. Avery was still. I'll make sure, she said. The carrier signal held for 3 more seconds. Then it went silent. She gave the handset to Gallagher. He looked at it, looked at her. 8 months, he said. That's how long he said he'd been looking for you. Yes. And he found you in Blackwood Forest because Driscoll's targeting told him where you were. He turned the handset over once, which means Driscoll's operation is what brought Calder back into contact with institutional channels. Yes. So Driscoll, in trying to eliminate a problem, created the conditions that eliminated himself. She thought about that. People who operate from positions of certain authority tend to underestimate what they can't see, she said. Gallagher made the almost laugh sound again. This time it completed itself slightly more fully. Get some sleep, Cross, he said. She went. Oh. The morning came early and gray, the same cold October sky that had been watching Blackwood Forest when the first bullet found Drake. She was up before it fully arrived, sitting on the same concrete bench Reyes had been on the night before, with coffee that was better than the forest had offered, but not by an amount that deserved celebration. Reyes found her there at 5:30. He sat on the other end of the bench. He had his own coffee. They sat in the particular companionable silence of people who had been through something together and no longer needed to fill the air between them with words to justify the proximity. The hills were just visible in the early gray. Somewhere in them, Blackwood Forest was beginning its day. The way Forest did. Indifferently, continuously, without reference to what had happened in its trees the afternoon before. Vega wants to talk to you, Reyes said. I know. I told him the version, last night. He paused. He didn't say much. What did he say? Reyes looked at his coffee. He said, and I'm quoting because it's Vega and the exact words matter, I called her the maybe and she saved 8 people including me, and I owe her an apology that is going to be extremely uncomfortable for both of us. He paused. Then he asked if you'd prefer he do it in private or in front of the whole element. Something moved in Avery's face that wasn't quite a smile, but shared the same neighborhood. Private, she said. That's what I told him. The morning light advanced across the vehicle pool, pale and cold, and without ceremony. Somewhere in the facility behind them, Drake was probably awake and probably arguing with the morning nurse about something that the morning nurse was going to win. Barrow was probably on her second round of the medical bay. The director was probably in a room with 3 phones and 2 tablets, working through the consequences of last night in the organized, relentless way she'd given the impression of approaching everything. Somewhere in the hills, a man named Calder was watching something. The facility, the forest, the outcome of 18 months of operating in the dark, and deciding on his timing. And here, on a concrete bench outside a military facility, in a country that sat on the uncomfortable edge of a conflict without clean names, Avery Cross drank bad coffee in the early morning cold and felt, for the first time in a long time, that she could identify clearly, like something had come to rest. Not resolved in the way that meant finished. Nothing in her work was ever finished in that clean way. But resolved in the way that meant she knew who she was inside it, knew what she was for. Knew that the people sitting 2 floors above her and at the other end of this bench were the people she intended to stand next to when the next thing came. She'd spent 2 years being a ghost and 6 months being a maybe. She was done with both. Reyes finished his coffee, set the cup on the bench between them. "Directors meeting at 0800, he said. "Gallagher said to tell you." "I know." "You ready?" She looked at the hills, at the gray sky beginning its slow commit to morning. "Yes," she said. She meant it in all the ways a person can mean a word. They went inside together. The ones who underestimate you have given you something they don't know they've given, time and the advantage of their own certainty. The question is never whether you are seen. The question is what you do